Hello viewers, and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40,000 Conquest video production. My name is Mitch, and I am the Hive Tyrant. Today I'm pleased to present you with still another installment in my continuing series of Community Spotlight videos, in which I interview various prominent and upstanding members of the Conquest LCG community. In the past, we discussed guests' favorite decks and how very best to pilot their preference of Warlord. But, now that I've completed an initial interview and guest analysis for each of our first 14 Warlords, I now look to assess and explore the recently pre-released Warlords of the Great Devourer Deluxe expansion. So, expect a discussion that's largely based on experience, but nevertheless still contains some speculation and theory. But, hopefully through my guests sharing their impressions and opinions, all within the context of hundreds of previous pre-Tyranid games worth of experience, they'll be able to provide you with a wealth of information useful to both new and veteran players alike. If you enjoyed this video, remember to hit that like button, ensure you are subscribed, and if so inclined, you're encouraged to share, because the more engagement this content receives, the more viewers are reached, and ever the broader we help grow our Conquest community. But, with our introduction aside, let's get things started with the discussion of the new Tyranid Warlord, Old One-Eye. Well, thank you very much for joining me today, but before you tell me how exactly it was that you ended up with those scars, why don't you introduce yourself and let our viewers know how you're involved in our Conquest LCG community?
Hello. Most of you might know me as just Peter, but I actually like to refer to myself as my favorite warlord, Old One-Eye. I'm not really that interesting of a person. I am kind of the common man. Unlike many of Mitch's other guesses, I don't run a fancy podcast or anything like that. I just like to think of myself as the average man. The average man that likes to run deadly powerful Tyranids.
Sure. I suppose, how long have you been playing Conquest?
Oh, almost a year now, I'd have to say. But I think I'll be playing this game for quite some time, for sure.
Well, I suppose, you've certainly got the attraction to Tyranids, which I could definitely relate to, but what exactly got you started in the first place? What was, the initial appeal?
Alright, so a little background history for me. I was always kind of interested in it back when I was, about 16 or 14. I saw the really cool models, then I saw the artwork and whatnot, and then me and my brother, what we got was, we actually started to actually get into it. We actually got some of the books, and we were just sucked in by the amazing lore. For Steven, he loved not just the Space Marines, but the Grey Knights, supposedly having the gene seed of the Emperor himself, uncorruptible soldiers fighting against the demon forces. Meanwhile, I preferred the ever-famous Tyranids, devourers of galaxies and horror of the unknown.
Sure. I mean, it seems like you two are kind of the exact antithesis of one another. It's this bastion of humanity out there to purge the universe of Xenos, and then you're taking the role of the alien scum. But, what is it in particular about this game that you enjoy most? I love the 40k universe. I think you might care for it ever so slightly more than I do. But what is the particular appeal? Why stick with Conquest, maybe as opposed to tabletop 40k?
Well, the main thing was, I was never really into the tabletop. I mean, we loved the formula, but we were into the painting, the modeling, and then, on the tabletop, it just wasn't our thing. But as a former Magic the Gathering player, I found myself a natural fit for the card game. It sucked me in with its familiar but ingenious formula, and I soon found myself I'd like to consider talented with the game. Nowhere near as much as other players are, but this game just gave me a sense of familiarity, but also it gave me something new and exciting and different in all the right ways.
Well, given like a Magic the Gathering history, which I myself can relate to, what are some of the most unique aspects that really made it stand a cut above its competitive card game competition?
Oh, I could go into so many details. First off, rather than having what is known as the player planeswalker, instead you are focused as your warlord, this champion that's actively in the playing field, moving about. And it's also the way you can easily get destroyed. The battlefield isn't just one massive thing that just everything globs into, but rather separate, different battlefields all across the galaxies. Wars raging and blood lost throughout the stars.
Sure. I mean, I definitely like the spatial component to it, and there's so much less abstraction than just some theoretical plane where there are two wizards doing battle. So definitely a hell of a lot of stuff to like about Conquest, but out of all the different Warlords we've seen thus far, we've seen our core set introducing 7, the Warlord cycle introduced 7. You're one of those scarcely few lucky individuals that's managed to get his scything talons on the Great Devourer itself. Out of our 2 Tyranid Warlord choices, you've got a predilection, a soft spot for Old One-Eye. What is it about him that makes him stand out among all our other options as particularly appealing to you?
Well, you see, Mitch, even though I started around the time of the core set, to be exact, I believe Ragnar was out about the time, I didn't really find a warlord that fit my style. That was until old Kugoth came on the scene. He gave me a warlord that was durable and reliable, and I didn't have to be so very careful with the way I played him. So when the Tyranids came, and I saw Old One-Eye, his playstyle matched so much to Kugoth. How surprised I was to learn that Old One-Eye has so many wonderful things about him, and maybe even some more nicer features than I prefer with Kugoth.
Well, I suppose just seeing as how they're so similar, they've both got some sort of regeneration ability. Old One-Eye, of course, just pulls damage tokens off of himself. Kugoth instead kind of gives it as a gift to his enemy. What are some of those defining features that makes you prefer Old One-Eye over Kugoth?
Well, one of the big things is, of course, it being their Tyranids. I love the Tyranids. I do love Nurgle. They're easily my second favorite faction, but I really just can't compare it against the Tyranids. It's also how the damage removal works, and also his signature squad. What really defines a warlord that I've also started to like so much, which we will get into soon enough, I'm sure.
Definitely. And I suppose before we move on, why not the Swarm Lord? Certainly you've got fondness for the Tyranids, as much, if not more so, than I do, but why prefer Old One-Eye?
Well, the Swarm Lord is very nice, and I don't doubt his abilities. I remember seeing him at a tournament recently. To be exact, 4 of them. No Old One-Eye. Everyone just turned an eye on him. Poor guy, just lonely out there. He wants to devour your biomass just as much as the Swarm Lord, but the Swarm Lord definitely can prove the power of tokens and the sheer number generation. It is such a ridiculous token generator that running the Turvagon Synapse unit will actually result in you maxing out too early. So you'll actually want to run something else due to the Swarm Lord's ability to, well, create swarms.
Sure. Well, just kind of back on the subject of Old One Eye, clearly the Swarm Lord excels at filling the battlefield with those tokens. But what are Old One Eye's areas of greatest strength? Where does he excel where the Swarm Lord might flounder?
Well, they both share an equal amount of toughness, but due to the Old One Eye's abilities, he himself can be often more in the fray as a very savage, relentless bully, and his signature squad plays into that, making him quite a fearsome foe to face. It also has that effect of Kugoth, where you keep on trying to hit him so hard, but he still keeps going.
Well, you happen to mention his signature squad specifically. I suppose, how do you kind of envision striking a balance between, getting damage onto Old One Eye, but still keeping him and his Hormagaunts, safe enough where you don't have to worry about them ultimately being destroyed?
That is a very delicate balance. See, with Old One Eye, you have to remember, unlike Kugoth, who can always constantly move damage, Old One Eye can only do it once. So you have to be very precise with figuring out what their attack values are, weighing it, realizing when to shield, when to not shield, when to actually delay the regeneration ability, take some more damage, and then shed it off. Especially with his signature squad, which actually works with him being injured, and actually works against your opponents so eagerly trying to inflict pain on him.
Sure. I mean, it just seems of the absolute paramount importance. You know exactly what tricks your opponent might be running, just because it is going to be such a tricky balance between in taking a lot of damage, getting the most out of his regenerative ability to kind of play into some of his other card effects, yet all the while not setting yourself up for some, devastating bloodying or something like that, just because he loses so much of his ability. But just in regard to his strengths, do you feel that there are any matchups, any specific factions or warlords where Old One Eye really excels against?
Oh, let's see. Well, one combatant I would like to say that would actually probably be bad, or I mean, he would be good against, is with Zarather. Zarather, even though he has the ability to increase damage, the ability to round up with his regeneration usually means he'll be shedding off that extra damage token. He will then eagerly deliver pain onto that fragile sixth body, and soon bloody Zarather losing his key ability.
Sure, I suppose one immediate concern that's been bouncing around the community lately is ensuring that between the lurking Hormagaunts and Old One Eye, if Zarather is present, you definitely want to be careful with that reassignment of damage, just because each and every time you assign damage, that does trigger Zarather's ability. But given Old One Eye's capacity to really conjure up, big numbers when it comes to hitting extraordinarily hard, I could definitely see being able to overpower Zarather's relatively frail body. I mean, just the heights of attack power that Old One Eye can accomplish relative to the other warlords we've seen can definitely be pretty staggering. Are there any other factions or matchups where he stands maybe a better than average chance?
Well, let's see. I think with the orcs, since they are very blunt, very forward with their tactics. Old One Eye won't have to worry about so many surprises like he would with the ever relentless Dark Eldar or Space Marines.
Sure. I suppose outside of like Battle Cry and a couple other kind of corner case effects like that, you understand for the most part what those numbers incoming are going to be. There's no drop pod assault to, suddenly inflict some enormous unexpected blow.
Ah, yes, honored librarians. I actually like to think of the lurking Hormagaunts as the lurking librarians, just because how they work. But I'll bring that up once we get to them.
Sure. Well, I suppose just one important consideration when it comes to any deck is ally options. And of course, the Tyranids don't so much get many of those. So how do you envision building an old One-Eye deck? So relative to the Swarm Lord, what are some basic considerations, staples, auto-includes?
Well, some auto-includes are definitely going to be shared between the Warlords. Since they don't have space pirates, since, they would probably just eat them along with the rogue traders, they instead have to rely on their own unique resource generator and also overall infector, and also one of my favorite types of Tyranids, the toxic venom throat with 2 command, which totally dominates and out-dominates many of the space pirates and a lot of command units. 2 toughness to give it a chance to escape in case they're trying to hunt it down. You get the option of infesting, and if it's already infested, getting either a resource or card, whatever's needed. You're always going to run 3 for sure. I don't know what you would replace them with. Another really strong candidate is the vanilla Tyranid Warrior. At just a 3 cost, you get 2 command, 2 damage, and a hardy 4 HP. It is quite a reliable unit, and unlike the Venom Thrope, when the battle comes to them and they're done their job of command, they're eager to get into battle and to devour their weaker foes.
Well, sure, I suppose. Do you see it being viable at all? I know when you mentioned the Swarm Lord and Gravid Turvagon being kind of redundant with just how many tokens you put into play, what are some of your approaches to combat for Old One-Eye? Like, what kind of army units do you include?
I actually run a unique deck amongst most Tyranid players. I actually do not run any of the Termagant tokens. Instead, I focus on the larger, harder hitting, and trickier elite units of the Tyranid Swarm, such as the Ravenous Hara Specs or Hara. I'm not sure how to pronounce that.
I suppose personally I go with Haru specs, but I don't know if there's one way or another.
Fun fact, it is not just a made up word. It comes from the old word for someone who divines the future by reading entrails. Very fitting for a creature that is a giant mouth that tears apart creatures and then devours them.
Sure, I know when when the model was released, it's a little bit of an eyebrow raiser into just like the level of gory detail that Games Workshop decided to go with that one.
Well, with Old One Eye, since I'm running an elite focus deck, trying to get in that terrifying shrieking harpy, as well as the horror specs, this means I need to get a lot of command, a lot of resources, and I hope that Yvonne's there so I can cheat them out and make my opponents cry.
Well, I suppose my initial thought is a lot of players have kind of been concerned that the Tyranid command presence is a little lacking. Does it seem very viable? Like, do you manage to get the cards and resources required to get out the Harpy and Haru specs?
You would be surprised how easy it is to actually get command. I feel the lack of command issue that they brought up was very early in their calling. If you recall, way back in the first days of the game, people said, oh, Del Galdar, they are easily the weakest of the factions and will not do well.
Sure.
And of course, we now know that Kith is got the first worlds. The Tyranids have an amazing array of good, strong, solid command units, units that often infect as well. And in addition to that, they also have their Synapse unit. And unless you're running Savage Warrior Prime, you're going to be able to constantly move a unit to either an unused planet or to out-command a different planet, which means a lot of times you're going to be choking them of resources while gaining resources.
Well, for sure. I mean, I suppose before we go back to the elites, what is your typical choice when it comes to Synapse unit? What's your personal preference?
I originally ran the Savage Warrior thinking that clearly this battle unit was good for a bully like Old One-Eye, but I found that he is actually very fragile and does not work to the goals. Since I have found that in my personal opinion, the best suit for him is the Venom Throat Polluter. It has 1 command, 1 attack, and 4 HP, and when it goes to a planet, it can then decide how many, if any, units it wants to move. And since it actually triggers after the Warlords have already gone to their planets, if the commander happens to be there, if you're trying to hunt them down to bring units, or you don't want to get involved and not bring them at all, you have that option available to you. It gives you 1 command, so you're easily able to just add in 1 more to capture a command or add 1 more to overtake a command. And even if that's not the case, you can just do it to choke out them for resources. Another amazing ability is since you can move units, elites and heavy command units either to a new planet to initiate command, or you can move elites to new planets so they can expect a giant harpy readied at the next planet and pray that you do not have initiative, and then you exhaust all their units.
Well, just because our current meta is so anti-elite and it so favors numbers, do you have any other, like, clever advice for how to get some of those elites functioning? Like how to ensure that the Haruspex is able to land those killing blows to generate resources, or that the Harpy can get off its, like, exhausting volley? How do you get those to function?
Well, some of them involve just actually how easy it is to infest. Cards like Spore Chimney will activate at the headquarters phase and infest a planet with little to no effort, allowing you to trigger some of those abilities with ease. Finding Yvarn or other ways to exploit them out is also a good way to do it. And also, I found that Tyranid attachments is what really helps the elites. The card a Regeneration, which only has a cost of 1, but gives 2 toughness and the ability to remove 2 damage, is a absolutely beautiful card for making sure that your investment remains on the battlefield, and also giving your opponent nightmares.
Sure.
There's also the Heavy Venom Cannon in case 3 damage from the Horuspex wasn't enough to kill a unit. Speaking of which, his ability to get resources is so ridiculously powerful, I actually ended up in a battle with 15 resources. But since I didn't have enough card draw, They just sat there looking pretty while Ragnar destroyed my face. But that's a story for another time.
Sure. Well, maybe we'll eventually see a Tyranid Firestorm card. But definitely, as the Tyranids are brand new, there's so much fascinating experimentation going on. So it's definitely going to be a careful balance we'll have to strike between card draw, between resource acceleration. So I suppose, what are Old One Eye's areas of weakness? You happen to mention that Ragnar was able to best you.
That was a very close battle. I actually feel that if I had taken more time to invest in card draw, that old One Eye strength might have been able to push through. But sadly, since I did not make the wisest of tactical choices, Ragnar had gotten his claim.
Sure. Well, I suppose apart from, not to mean any offense, but apart from user error, are there any, like, particular matchups where Old One Eye seems to struggle?
Well, I have not quite tested him enough to be completely sure, but it shows that I have found that the Dark Eldar have proven to be deadly as ever. I adjusted my deck to even deal with that because, as it stands, the Tyranids do not have too many options to deal mass damage to the very, very fragile Dark Eldar, but hard hitting as well. This is why I would suggest anyone running against them run the Virulent Spore Sacks. At 2 cost, 1 command, 0 attack, and 1 defense, you can sacrifice them as a combat action to deal 1 damage to all of your enemies, and then infest the planet. This usually means that most of those pesky Dark Eldar are going to die due to their fragile bodies. Or they could risk something like an Archon's Terror to make it leave, and then you've just lost a 0-1. So it can easily be a win-win depending on the situation. I think it will be the Swarm Lord, though, who will better deal with Kith, since Dark Eldar hit at single targets well, not many countless thousands of teeth well.
Sure. Well, Clavek's War Leader is certainly much less offensive when used against maybe a hive mind specialization unit, as opposed to something like a Shrieking Harpy, to be sure. Any other cards or warlords pose a significant issue, like any counters to one or Old One Eye that are, really evident?
Well, yes, when you're dealing with Old One Eye, if you were going to run elites like I did, you will deal with the usual elite removal, but I feel that Old One Eye is, and a lot of the Tyranid cards are giving elites new options to deal with them. But you will still struggle with certain cards. The surprising ability of the Space Marines with their drop pods will undo most tactics, and unlike the Swarm Lord, which distributes their forces over spaces, I believe Old One Eye won't exactly have that power, though it's not completely out of his ability to run tokens. The Tyranids are still very new and haven't even been sold yet, so for their complete weaknesses and strengths, it's still much of a mystery.
Sure. I mean, hell, I'm sitting here calling myself the Hive Tyrant, and I haven't had the opportunity to play with the Tyranids yet, so there's definitely so much that remains to be seen, so much speculation to be done, and just like I alluded to earlier, I think it's ultimately going to be a balancing act. I think a lot of people view Old One Eye as the more elite favoring Tyranid warlord, whereas the Swarm Lord runs swarms, but just like you yourself said, it doesn't...
Pardon me for a moment, Mitch, but that actually reminded me something. In the current Tyranid meta, you will actually find one noticeable weakness about them, and that is the lack of 2 shield cards. As I am looking through my cards, there is only one card that I run in this deck that can produce 2 shields, and most of the rest are just producing 1 shield. So when it comes to preventing lots of attacks, the Tyranids don't have much in the current meta for dealing when using shields.
Sure, I suppose, like you mentioned, regeneration is definitely an option, but that was something that held Chaos back as well at first before they ended up getting Slanesh's Temptation, just the sheer lack of shielding ability. But what I was mentioning earlier is I just feel like it's going to be this huge balancing act between which aspects of economy you try to gear your deck toward. You mentioned that the Swarm Lord, as soon as you hit that 10 token cap, if you do, you're potentially missing out on a lot of ability, so every token that you should have generated, but which you're not allowed to, is just wasted potential. Have you experimented much with, running Termagant token generators with Old One Eye?
At the moment, I'm still working out the kinks of how he works with elites and heavier units. I do like to run a softer, smaller base, which his signature squad at a measly 2 cost helps, since what you want to do is have a light, quick force able to gain resources and to keep up battles before you can get out those harder, deadlier elites to help in the fight.
Sure. Well, just viewing things from the ground up, because there are many, many players, myself included, out there that haven't had a chance to pick up the Tyranid box set, which is only available to an extremely limited audience at the moment. What's your general strategy? So from the start of the game, you've got your Warlord, you've got your Synapse units. How do you approach command? How do you approach those first few rounds, and then hopefully pilot it home to a victory?
Well, the early game focuses on trying to either get resources or choke out resources. The Ripper Swarm is a 0-cost unit, but has a command, attack, and 1 point of toughness. Having this free unit, in addition to your only 6 cost starting, makes things much easier. And even though it's not a rogue pilot, it's certainly enough to get some resources into your pocket and to draw. Getting a Venom Throw out early or a Synaptic Link will also help your other resources needs.
But it sounds like you definitely do favor resources in the early game to fund the elites.
Yes, and on the first planets, or the planets that you will want to fight over, you will want to place some of your cheaper units there, ready to vanguard and attack. Once you do get the first amount of resources, which probably be the turn after, you'll be able to play your first Horus box, and that will actually start paying for itself if played correctly.
Sure. Well, I suppose kind of my big question is, do you overall view Old One Eye as being competitive? Paul Steiner's games results statistical database is still in the early stages of taking in Tyranid data, so it's kind of this ebb and flow between, does the Swarm Lord have a higher win rate, does Old One Eye, but do you see Old One Eye as potentially being tournament viable?
I'd like to say personally that all warlords have a potential to be competitive. Even in the lower tier, higher tier, you'll find that the separation in strength is not as separated as something in Magic where cards can just be outright useless. I find that one Old Eye, not for himself, but rather for his amazing signature squad, will definitely see tournament play. But I honestly view, in my perspective, that all warlords have a chance. I recall Davis Kingley, who got second place in the first Worlds, discussing how that a Colonel Strachan was actually doing very well in the tournament, even though the player himself was quite new to the game. So never be afraid to try on Warlord that even seems weak at the moment, because in this game, thanks to Fantasy Flight's careful attention to detail, all Warlords have a lot of strength. But honestly, due to our current favoritism in the meta, I think Swarmlord will most likely be the preferred choice, seeing how something like Kith, who also is a token generator, is much more favored. But I would also like to state that the Tyranid elites are starting to show a new kind of elite, a new kind of unit that could become more viable for the scene. For example, the Horus Bucks at 3/5 with one command can easily pay itself by destroying 2 and 3 cost units, and it can go from easily getting discounted to paying itself and even gaining you revenue. Meanwhile, the Harpy is a strong counter to the large armies that people like to build up. If you were to face a Swarm Lord and the planet would most likely be infested, the Shrieking Harpy would attack and then end up exhausting all those hive mind keyword units as well as the tokens. Something like that suppresses the larger mass forces. By the way, it doesn't affect elites, will definitely slowly change the meta. As it's been said by some of the people working at Fantasy Flight, they are starting to want to open up avenues for elites and units like that.
Well, I suppose what is it that holds you back from just announcing right out the gate that Old One Eye is just some absolute, formidable beast of a warlord that, kicks Kith out of position as the top tier? What is it that holds him back from just...
Oh, well, it's more just so how people view it. I'm kind of an optimistic idealist. If you ask me, I think if I played better than with the Kith, after all, I've actually not played against Kith too often myself. I've faced more like with the likes of Ragnar, Kato, commanders like those rather than Kith. So it's kind of always surprising to me. But I would like to say that I think he could actually take on the Dark Eldar. See, the Dark Eldar, I guess I'd have to explain why his signature squad would work so well against Kith.
Sure. I mean, that was gonna be my next question, so by all means, dive on in.
Alright, so let's break down his signature squad, which I vastly favor over the very similar Kugoth build, but I think is honestly almost strictly better. First off, let's start off with the attachment. It is the standard 1 cost, 3 shields. We all know this song and dance. Attached to your warlord, it gives him 1 extra HP, which is pretty insane, seeing he's already shedding up to 3 possible damage and more as it goes on. And then, as a reaction, you get an attack equal to how much damage you removed, rewarding you for just being yourself.
Right.
This heavy hitting could easily deal a massive amount to Kith, for example. And seeing that Kith is so eager to give you damage, you can strike back. There is also 2 events that are also incredibly wonderful. For 1 cost, you can make it that a Synapse or Warlord unit gets brutal until end of turn. And due to the generous amount of HP and more HP, with great scything talons, you can easily deliver a heavy, brutal blow to your opponent, easily getting up to 6 damage, which I actually pulled off with a Savage Warrior onto Ragnar. He was only saved by the grace of Indomitable, which Kith does not have the luxury of.
Sure. I mean, I think you touched on something really important when you said that it kind of rewards Old One-Eye for being himself. It's not necessarily this finicky thing that you have to orchestrate and...
Oh yes, with Kugoth, even though I like his event, Fetid Haze, which is godlike, being able to completely remove all the damage on the Warlord and generously gift it onto your now choking, coughing, sneezing, wheezing, very, very sick enemies. But his signature units and support is extremely lackluster, to say the least. Meanwhile, we can look onto Old One-Eye's things and find them to be deadly. Now, let's talk about the Lurking Hormagaunts, or as I stated before, the Lurking Librarians. This is a 2-cost unit with 1 resource, 3 brutal attack, and 1 HP. It has the reaction after this unit is assigned damage, you can reassign 2 of it to your Warlord instead. So it has that same sort of damage evasion that the Librarian has, and what makes it so deadly and reputable. And with the Lurking Hormagaunts, you can do some clever mind tricks. So let's say, I'm going to be fighting someone. The Lurking Hormagaunt swings for 3, which kills so many units. I believe it's like 75% of units that have at least 3 or more. Like an Exhausted Blood Angels or something like that.
Sure.
And also, key note, if you're hitting something with flying, that damage is enough to round up to 2, so you're still doing solid. Now, the ability is where it gets really interesting. Most of the time when they get hit, you'll redirect it to your Warlord. Or you can let them die. The beauty is they'll be trying to hit for 3 or more, wanting to be sure that you don't shield it or just mildly mitigate it, but you can let them waste all that precious damage trying to get rid of them and say, you know what, have it. Congratulations, you're down one of your strongest units trying to take down one of mine. Now excuse me while the Horus Bucks devours your guts.
Right. Well, I mean, it's definitely anything you can do to kind of force your opponent to over-invest in any one action is absolutely fantastic. And I mean, just like you said, if they're wasting some, one of their most dangerous attacking units just to kill something with a single hit point, definitely ends up working out favorably for you. And if you can take advantage of that damage transfer, then that's all the better. I suppose, how do you view the only signature card we've yet to talk about, the 3-cost Awakening Cavern?
Oh yes, Awakening Cavern is simplistic beauty. It is 3 cost, and it has an action, mind you, action, so you can use this for key command controls. Exhaust the support to ready target unit you control. This card is ridiculous. First off, I love the art. You see a frozen Old One-Eye chilling out. Anyways.
You can't see me, or you can't hear me groaning, but I'm groaning right now.
I love my puns. They're my greatest strength. Anyways, so what we have here is something that's simple, but it can change so much. First of all, it can ready a unit for an attack, the most obvious thing. It can ready a unit that's been positioned to a planet to then ready it for command. It can be used to ready your Warlord quickly if you need to shed off the damage very quickly. It can be used to counter something that exhausts your units, like Mini Eldar or the Imperial Guard, or as you players might better know them, the Astra Militarum's suppressive fire. Just being able to ready one unit can make a big difference, especially in a deck where you favor elite units. You give them another chance to make your opponent's life a nightmare. Oh, and heaven forbid that you actually do it on something that has area effect damage, such as units equipped with the heavy venom cannon, because the only thing better than 2 damage to all of your opponent's units on that planet is 4 damage to all your opponent's units on that planet.
Well, just given the steep initial cost of that card, is it something you do typically play, or do you find yourself...
Here's the thing. Even though it's steep, half of your beginning resources, any time I have gotten on my hand, I have usually played it right away. I've maybe waited till the next turn, but it will pay for itself immediately. It can be used for something at the first planet where you're not going to have many resources or units, or the second planets where that'll be still the case, to wait until everything's been exhausted and sneak in one more attack. Or you could even have Old One-Eye attack, then ready him to leave the battle, leaving them damaged, hurt, and with a Pyrrhic victory, a victory that was more painful than it was successful.
Sure. Well, just in regard to, pulling all of this stuff together, do you have any, favorite memories playing as Old One-Eye, where everything has come together and you've really been able to demonstrate just how potentially powerful he can be?
Well, let's see, what was a good example? This was actually more of an example where I was losing, but I just enjoyed how, even though in my losing moment, just because it was only one card that could have stopped it, it was just so frightening. So I was playing the Savage Warrior Prime, a 2/5. It had received 4 points of damage. It was ready at the moment, and I had the movement. And what I did is I swung it with Primal Fury at 6 damage onto Ragnar. Now, Ragnar was only saved, and could have only been saved, by the grace of Indomitable. But many other factions and units do not have that luxury. So many other warlords or units would have died right there horribly, and not even a 3-cost shield would have probably redeemed them from something as brutal as that. I am actually having trouble recalling some other keen moments. Honestly, I enjoy just playing anytime I can with Old One-Eye. He is just so fun and easy to play, and many times he's so resilient that it is just a blast, either winning or losing, just to be Old One-Eye.
Well, I think that's probably a designer goal of a game, is to even make something like a loss still feel like an enjoyable, if not rewarding experience. But just on the subject of, memories, do you happen to have any just favorite combos that you like to pull off? Some of those things that give you the most enjoyable experience?
Oh, yes. Of course there is the Awakening Chamber, and something on the, for example, abusing the Horuspex, or Horuspex. I think it's, no, or Specs? Whatever. Anyways, what you can do with that unit is you can attack, munch up some small unit that can't handle 3 damage, get about 3 resources, and then you can ready him again to do it again. And at the end of the battle, you might end up a rich man. And in the next battle coming, you'll be able to get out another elite, or just empty out your hand onto your battlefield and watch your opponents slowly sob as they know they can't do anything against your overwhelming forces.
Sure. I mean, I suppose the Haruspex's ability is limited to once per phase, but definitely, especially if you're opting to run things like the Heavy Venom Cannon, it still packs quite a bit of a punch. And if you amplify that with attachments, it just makes it all the more worthwhile of readying again. I suppose something else I was kind of curious about is just how do you view neutral cards? Like, what are some of those additions that you include?
Never ever forget the neutral cards. Neutral cards on your Tyranid deck, even though you can't run regular units, are your friend, especially the card Fall Back. At one cost, you can save one of your biggest units. So let's say your opponent thinks they're clever because they downed your Synapse unit, or they think themselves so triumphant because they were able to finally take down the Harpy. You then pay one measly resource and it's back, completely healthy and ready to take vengeance. And to make it better, if you have Awakening Chamber, you can ready him when he moves with your Warlord to get in the first revenge attack.
Sure. Well, I suppose let's say that there comes a time when the Great Devourer is eventually made publicly available, and some of us have an opportunity to play as or against the Tyranids. If a player is struggling to beat Old One-Eye, what's maybe some advice how they can win out against our elite favoring Tyranid Warlord?
Hit hard, hit fast. What you need to do is you need to make sure that you can get something out strong. You need to make sure that you can really deal the damage and make it that even Old One-Eye's regeneration can't even handle the fire. I would think that Chaos out of most factions would do this the easiest. Chaos is resilient, but also has the ability to deal lots of damage. The sort of damage you'll need to take care of the strength of a more elite-focused Tyranid deck. And then you have things such as Warp Storm or Cacophonic Choir, which you can easily use to deal damage to all the units across the battlefield, giving whatever chance you can to help out. If you were playing Eldar, Dark Eldar, seeing how it is and lead focused, you will want to do your best to do what you do best, choking them out and making sure that they can't play out those big units. You will need to be careful as the Tyranids are not afraid to show their own command might. And since we are still free to run promotion as the Tyranids, the Tyranid units will eagerly use that for their own purposes.
Right. Well, I suppose just as we kind of draw things to a close here, any final thoughts for players running Old One-Eye or running up against him? Just any advice or encouragement or anything like that, since you're one of those scarce, lucky few that has had, actual Tyranid experience.
I would suggest that with something as powerful as his support, one of the few supports in the game that will see constant use throughout the game, that running one support removal card like Squig and Bombman to get rid of that could decimate and hurt and easily lose that advantage that I had at the moment. It may be one card, but it can easily change the game as much as Kugoth getting his banner. Also, don't give me Yavharn. If you give me Yavharn, I'm just going to play my elite units out, and that's not going to be happy for you unless, well, you're Chaos and you're having Black Legion and Helldrakes.
Definitely. Knowledge of the planets, looking out for Karnath to potentially trigger a Yavharn, all sorts of nasty stuff like that. And especially, like you mentioned, your preference for the Venom Throat Polluter, if you can suddenly reel in some big nasty unit to Yavharn and then overpower your opponent there, that could just easily spell out disaster. Something that's already looking bad for your opponent could very quickly spiral out of control.
Not to mention, you can use that unit that just went to your HQ from Yvonne to then position it to a planet. Then once it gets to that planet, it's going to be ready. And now your opponent's just going to have to figure out how they're going to deal with an infested planet with a giant lurking harpy ready to make them cry.
Right. Well, any closing thoughts before we wind things down?
Well, just make sure that when you play the game that you always know that having fun is one of the most important things. I mean, the old one-eye, who knows, maybe he won't be the star that I hope him to be. I love this commander, and I think he's one of the funnest things for me. But I also understand that he might not be the top. But I don't really think that matters for me. What matters is just how much I enjoy this game, especially the community.
Sure. Well, an extraordinarily healthy mindset to have, and seeing as how I just did my big State of the Meta video with Sam Mann, even comparing our pinnacle top-tier Warlord Kith to the very bottom of the barrel Urian, she's winning 6 out of every 10 games to his 4 out of every 10 on average. So considering that the biggest discrepancy in this game is so small, I think players find it all too easy to kind of blow that out of proportion in their mind. So whether Old One-Eye is top tier or middle of the pack, it sounds like there's definitely a lot of good reasons to play him, and he seems pretty straightforward, pretty enjoyable, and as with any Tyranid card, I'm very excited at the prospects of actually playing with him someday. But, thank you so much for coming on, Peter, and unless there's anything else you'd like to share, I suppose we'll just call it here.
Well, I wanted to give a little look into the future, if that was alright.
Sure, by all means.
Well, as we can see in our planetfall cycle, a very exciting, flavorful cycle, if I must say, we can already see one elite unit that's going to find its home in the Old One-Eye deck, especially if you're running elites, and that would be what is it? The something Ravener?
The Striking Ravener.
Yeah, the Striking Ravener. 2 command, 3 attack, and 5 toughness, only for a cost of 5. And if this unit destroys a unit in combat, it may ready. And unlike the Horuspux's ability to gain money at the destruction of limited 1 per phase, the Striking Ravener will continuously strike over and over and over again. And did I mention that you could use the Awakening Cavern in case they tried the shield and stop that striking combo?
Sure.
It is clearly a welcome unit into the Tyranid fold, and I'm sure more units will change it, and it won't take long before what I've said is probably completely different than when it's finally out and about.
Well, given that you mentioned earlier that the Haruspex is able to generate just such a huge wealth of resources, do you view like a simple substitution? Like, do you think that the Striking Ravener will outright replace it when it's released?
Not at all. I can easily see them running side by side. Even with my deck, I'm starting to notice could be some cards that I could easily replace.
Okay.
And I would end up with about a total of 6 elite units. I find that having those flexible options are really useful, and having a 3/5 body either way is extremely useful to have, especially if you slap on a regeneration and now it's a 3/7 and can heal wounds each turn. Might as well be a warlord at that point.
Sure, I'm kind of picturing a Tyranid Noah's Ark where all of the elites are entering some big boat, 2 by 2 by 2, but anything else you'd like to share before we get things going?
No, this will conclude it for now, and I thank you so much for letting me on my show, because I know for a fact I definitely didn't deserve to be spotlighted like this.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that, but I very much enjoyed having you on. I appreciate your time. I appreciate you sharing some of your initial Tyranid experience with our community. And, I thank you so much for your time, and have an excellent evening, my good sir.
Same to you.
Well, with our interview having ultimately drawn to a close, I'll just conclude this video by saying thank you once again for watching. Be sure to leave a comment sharing your own thoughts, perspective, experience, or even pure speculation on not just Old One-Eye, but the Tyranid faction as a whole. Interacting with viewers like you continues to be the absolute highlight of my creating content for this channel, so please take a moment to let me know what you thought of this interview and which warlord you'd like to see covered next. If you know someone that would make a good candidate to guest star in a future video, regardless of topic, feel free to share. But with that said, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you've not done so already. If you have already subscribed, you're encouraged to share this content, because the more that viewers engage with this video, the more views in turn it receives, and ultimately we stand only to grow our Conquest community. Feel free to contact me directly, and I genuinely love to see you keep in touch through social media. In fact, there are several exciting new projects in the works for Facebook.com/The Hive Tyrant specifically, so your liking that page would be deeply appreciated indeed. But, in any case, thank you very much for watching, and as always, be sure to check back in again soon for ever more Conquest LCG content to come.